Today at the National Press Club, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute, Michael Fullilove. Dr Fullilove will talk about the international and foreign policy challenges facing the new Albanese Labor government. Here's Michael Fullilove with today's National Press Club address.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. My name is Anna Henderson. I'm a director of the club and I'm also the chief political correspondent at SBS World News. Today's guest, we're very lucky to say, is Dr Michael Fullilove, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute. His speech is entitled A Three-Dimensional Foreign Policy. A new government, extraordinary foreign policy challenges for Australia, so a great time to have insights from an expert. If you're following the conversation online, you can find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAust and our hashtag. Everyone, please welcome Dr Michael Fullilove.
Thank you, Anna, for that introduction, and thank you to the National Press Club for inviting me to deliver my third address from this famous lectern. It's an honour to speak to you all today in these promising early weeks of a new period in Australian politics and foreign policy. To begin, let me acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I must tell you it's been an exciting week for me in the lead up to this address. Last Friday, the Russian state paid me the high compliment of blacklisting me along with 120 other Australians. Thank you. Thank you. So let me say welcome to anyone listening in today from Moscow. And welcome also to all my friends in this room today, including the Industry Minister, 3 Lowy Institute board members, several assistant ministers, senators, MPs, secretaries, directors general, commissioners, the British, Canadian, Papua New Guinea and New Zealand High Commissioners, and the ambassadors from Indonesia, France, Lithuania and Ukraine. Thank you all for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, a new government has taken office here in the nation's capital. It will be tested by events playing out at home and abroad. We are still emerging from a pandemic that has claimed more than 6 million souls and seized up the machinery of globalisation. We are 4 months into the unprovoked, unjustified and brutal invasion of Ukraine by its neighbour, Russia, a nuclear-armed power and permanent member of the UN Security Council. Every day, the liberal international order seems less liberal, less international and less orderly. For several years, Australia has been at daggers drawn with our most important economic partner, China. The People's Republic has sanctioned many of our exports and is currently probing for vulnerabilities in the Southwest Pacific with a view to projecting its influence close to our shores. The global economy is troubled with surging inflation and rising interest rates. The odds of a global recession are increasing rapidly. And all the while, of course, the planet continues to heat up. Australians are seized of these issues. Today, I will share with you a couple of advanced findings from the 2022 Lowy Institute poll, which we will release next week. This year, when thinking about world events, only 5 in 10 Australians say they feel very safe or safe. This represents a 17-point fall from last year and a 39-point fall from 2010, when 9 in 10 Australians felt safe. So in a bit more than a decade, we've gone from 9 in 10 to 5 in 10. It's not all bad news, however. The United States is now being led by a decent human being, something that wasn't true until relatively recently. In the defence of Ukraine, the Biden administration has led by example, providing weapons, intelligence and funds to Kyiv. Other Western countries, the scales falling from their eyes, have also stepped in. Sweden and Finland have applied to join NATO. There has been a quickening of connections between like-minded countries in the face of challenges from Russia and China. And by the way, has any country ever transformed its international reputation more swiftly and surely than Ukraine? Today, to be Ukrainian is shorthand for being brave, clever and charismatic. And none more so than Volodymyr Zelensky. There is a long-standing debate among historians as to whether history is made by vast impersonal forces or individual men and women. Zelensky's heroics show us that individuals matter. Individuals matter in Australian politics too. As the world rushes towards us, the leading figures of the new Australian government have gone out to meet it. Within 24 hours of being sworn in, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his formidable Foreign Minister, Senator Penny Wong, were meeting with the leaders of our Quad partners, the United States, India and Japan. Over the past month, the PM and his ministers have shown energy, purpose and dispatch in the manner in which they've carried out their international responsibilities. But in a sense, they had no choice. We face a set of circumstances that will test us as a people. We are now proximate to the world's largest powers, its sharpest rivalries and its biggest opportunities. The quality of our statecraft needs to lift accordingly. Over the course of our history, there has been an underlying continuity to the way Australian governments have perceived our national interests and worked to further them, including at the most difficult times. We've generally pursued a three-dimensional foreign policy as a means of keeping Australia prosperous and safe. These three dimensions are height, width and depth. Height refers to our long-standing strategic instinct to make common cause with a like-minded global ally. First the United Kingdom, then the United States. We've always regarded ourselves as a country with global interests. You see that in the cloisters of the Australian War Memorial down the road, which lists the many distant theatres in which Australians have served. You see it in our membership of the Five Eyes intelligence network. So that's height. The second dimension, width, involves participating in the activities of international institutions. Australian governments of both colours have worked through international institutions from the UN to the World Trade Organisation to the G20 to influence global decisions. If height and width have always framed Australia's international engagement, the third and final dimension, depth, has roared into prominence in recent decades. Depth means building the strongest possible relations with the countries around us in Asia and the Pacific. This three-dimensional approach is the most distinctive and interesting element of Australian strategy. The three dimensions have remained present throughout Australian history, although the relationship between them has varied depending on changing circumstances and different governments. Ladies and gentlemen, in March this year, both Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese gave speeches to the Lowy Institute setting out their worldviews. Mr. Morrison gave a confident speech. Russia's invasion of Ukraine seemed to vindicate, his binary worldview, and he was rightly proud of the coalition's achievements in bolstering Australia's domestic resilience, increasing our defence expenditure, and negotiating the AUKUS arrangement with the United Kingdom and the United States. But despite its strengths, Australia's international policy in the Morrison years was sometimes one-dimensional and unbalanced. Most of Prime Minister Morrison's efforts were invested in the first dimension that I mentioned, doubling down on the old alliance with the United States. He deserves credit for standing up AUKUS and securing access to the holy grail of US military technology, nuclear propulsion. Nuclear-powered submarines, which provide immense capability in terms of lethality, speed, range and stealth, will give Australia significant deterrent power. And in today's world, why would we not want the ability to deter acts of coercion? Mr. Morrison was instinctively sceptical, though, about the second dimension of foreign policy, engagement with the multilateral system. You will recall his 2019 Lowy lecture, in which he criticised negative globalism and what he called the unaccountable internationalist bureaucracy, and announced a comprehensive audit of Australia's involvement in global institutions. In fact, as events have shown, nationalism is a much greater concern for us than internationalism. And Mr. Morrison's approach in this regard was self-defeating. When countries like Australia step away from international institutions, other nations like China step in. And sure enough, in the months after that speech, the then Foreign Minister, Senator Marise Payne, was left to negotiate a course correction. DFAT's audit concluded that participation in these institutions is in fact in our interest. What about the Morrison government and the third dimension, our own region? The coalition government succeeded in thickening ties with our Quad partners, India and Japan. When I interviewed India's Minister of External Affairs, Dr. Jaishankar, he told me that if he had to pick one relationship that had progressed most satisfactorily in his term of office, it was that between New Delhi and Canberra. Closer to home, we should acknowledge Mr. Morrison's deep personal interest in the Pacific, which was manifested in the Pacific Step Up. Unfortunately, the initialling of a security agreement between China and Solomon Islands, a country with which we've had the most intimate relations over the past 2 decades, in the middle of the PM's campaign for re-election, showed the limits of our influence in that nation at least. And in between the Quad powers and the Pacific Island countries lies Southeast Asia, or as my colleague Hervé Lemaitre has dubbed it, the missing middle. Somehow in recent years, our focus on Southeast Asia got lost. And because the coalition government reduced Australia's overall aid envelope, the Pacific Step Up was paid for by a Southeast Asia Step Down. If the ends of our international policy were not always three-dimensional, there was also an imbalance in the means that we employed. We were properly weighted on defence, but underweighted on diplomacy and development. The coalition boosted defence spending from the underwhelming levels achieved in the Rudd-Gillard era, although, as critics have noted, major projects were delayed or cancelled. But there was no equivalent budget boost for diplomacy. And neither side is without sin here. In the 2 decades after 9/11, while funding for our military and security services has skyrocketed, funding for DFAT has flatlined. We have fewer diplomats posted overseas today than we did 3 decades ago. Our aid generosity has also drooped. In 2011, our aid-to-income ratio was 0.34% of GNI, which at that point was above the OECD average. A decade later, aid from the rich countries has increased, but our aid has plummeted to 0.21% of GNI. So in other words, the balance between defence on the one hand and diplomacy and development on the other got out of whack. Budgetary neglect was compounded by ministerial reticence. First, we took ourselves off the field for nearly 2 years by closing our international border. And as geopolitical competition in Asia intensified and other nations' officials crisscrossed our region, our ministers rarely left the country. And then, even after we reopened to the world, our diplomacy remained low profile, even at crisis points such as the rupture with Paris after the AUKUS announcement and the shock of the China-Solomon Islands agreement. So if the new government has hit the ground running, there is a lot of ground to catch up. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 days after Scott Morrison spoke to the Lowy Institute, I hosted Anthony Albanese. He began his speech by citing the wartime Labor Prime Minister John Curtin, who declared in December 1941 that Australia looks to America. Mr. Albanese described the United States as the global leader of democracies and the alliance as a central pillar of our foreign policy. And certainly, in my opinion, an alliance with a like-minded superpower is a pragmatic move for a Labor government that is intent on influencing events and improving the world. Canberra has a large job of work ahead in the bilateral relationship. It needs to push forward with AUKUS and cooperate with Washington on global issues such as climate change, as well as the full slate of regional issues. Australia will need to be a busy ally. And this will require skillful dealings with the Americans. And so I was pleased to see the PM get off to a warm start with President Biden and the other leaders in Tokyo. Several Prime Ministers have had twitchy starts to their foreign relations. Mr. Albanese was composed and comfortable in his own skin. The connection with President Biden was obvious. It confirmed a sense I had when I met with senior administration officials on a recent trip to Washington, that there's a real opportunity here. In President Biden and Prime Minister Albanese, we have two leaders whose personal stories chime and whose domestic policies rhyme. A more ambitious approach on climate and the resetting of relations with France will both be warmly welcomed in DC. Australia regards itself as one of America's best allies. But the truth is, many countries think they have a special relationship with Washington. And for some time, I've been concerned that the community of US officials and observers who know Australia well is too small. Washington is the most competitive political and diplomatic environment in the world, and we rely on a tiny group of mates. Over the past few years, therefore, the Lowy Institute has set about bringing influential Americans out to Australia to get to know our country well. This includes some very senior figures in the Biden administration, including National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Indo-Pacific Coordinator Kurt Campbell, US Ambassador to China Nick Burns, and senior NSC official Tom Wright. It also includes Republican Stephen Hadley, who was National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, and Corey Sharkey of the American Enterprise Institute, and commentators such as the New York Times' Brett Stevens, the Washington Post's David Ignatius, and the New Yorker's Susan Glasser. I'm proud of the role the Institute has played in expanding the circle of America's friends in Washington. A new friend of Australia will shortly arrive in this town, of course, Ambassador Caroline Kennedy, an accomplished diplomat with an impressive record of public service. Ambassador Kennedy will find that 8 decades after Curtin's famous intervention, Australians still look to America. In the 2020 Lowy Institute poll, the number of Australians who see the alliance as important to their security has returned to record highs. Nearly 9 in 10 Australians say the alliance is very or fairly important to Australia's security. This marks a 9-point increase from 2021 and is equal to the highest ever levels of support recorded a decade ago in the Obama era. So much for the Albanese government and the first dimension of Australian foreign policy. The second dimension, activism in international organisations such as the G20, the WTO and the UN, is embedded deep in Labor's DNA. In my opinion, it is silly to genuflect to the UN, just as it's pointless to obsess about its shortcomings. We need to deal with the world as we find it, which means getting on and using the UN and other institutions to further our interests and values. If we don't, others will. The Albanese government has indicated it intends to work through the UN to promote global action to tackle the climate crisis, including by bidding to co-host the 29th Conference of the Parties in 2024. Imagine if Australia were to become a leader in international climate negotiations, seeking to shape outcomes rather than a laggard seeking to stymie them. I hope this election signals the end of Australia's climate wars, which destroyed several prime ministers and nearly broke our politics. I must tell you, I have long been perplexed by the inconsistent approaches that Australian conservatives and progressives take to the two different issues of hard security and climate. Many on the right believe, apparently, that we should lead on security and free ride on climate. And many on the left believe we should lead on climate and free ride on security. But these are both good fights, and I'm in favour of fighting both of them. Australia can't stop global warming alone, and neither can we ensure stability in this region. But in both cases, we can make a meaningful contribution. And a sure route to failure is if countries such as Australia stand down rather than standing up. And of course, climate change itself presents new security challenges. I commend the Prime Minister's decision, which he foreshadowed in his speech to the Lowy Institute, to task the Director General of the Office of National Intelligence to undertake a risk assessment of the implications of climate change for national security. Finally, what should the Albanese government do along the third dimension of foreign policy, relations with our own part of the world, Asia and the Pacific? Let's start with China. In my view, the main reason why Australia now has a different relationship with China is that we're dealing with a different China. Its foreign policies have hardened and its willingness to accept criticism has disappeared. For nearly 3 years, Beijing has kept Canberra in the diplomatic deep freeze. And at the same time, China has subjected us to a campaign of economic intimidation, erecting trade barriers against Australian goods such as wine, barley, coal and cotton. I agree with the broad thrust of the former government's approach to China. That doesn't mean I'm uncritical. Diplomacy requires shrewdness as well as strength. In my view, we haven't always been as smart as we might have been. Sometimes Australian ministers and parliamentarians strayed beyond protecting our interests and values and allowed indiscipline and politics to creep into their public comments. There certainly seemed to be a lot of war talk. The chief responsibility for the current state of the relationship, though, lies with the men in Zhongnan High, in the leadership compound in Beijing. Their actions have changed the way Australians think about China. 4 years ago, over half of Australians, 52%, trusted China. But by last year, that figure had dropped to 16%. And I can reveal today that in the 2022 Lowy Institute poll, that number has fallen further to 12%. So while 9 in 10 Australians believe our alliance with the United States is important to our security, only 1 in 10 Australians trust China. This is no cause for celebration. It is in our interest that relations between Canberra and Beijing are stable and counterproductive. This is in China's interest too. We should certainly be on speaking terms with China, as are all our Quad partners. So it's good that Defence Minister Richard Marles met with his counterpart at the Shangri-La dialogue 10 days ago. But this is just a first step on a difficult path. If Beijing truly wished to reset relations with the new government, then seeking to wrap up the Pacific in a region-wide security agreement and endangering an RAAF surveillance aircraft in its first few weeks in office was not the best way to kick things off. Removing some of the restrictions on our exports would have been better. In the meantime, the Australian government should be firm, circumspect and disciplined. We should cooperate with China when we can, disagree when we must, and always stand our ground. We mustn't shrink Asia to the dimensions of China, however, which is something we've been guilty of doing in Australia. As well as working with Quad partners India and Japan, the government is right to redouble efforts in Southeast Asia. We have drifted apart in recent years as our economic relativities changed and our worldviews have diverged. And yet Southeast Asia remains profoundly important to us due to its economic weight and its strategic geography. We will need to work much harder to maintain our influence there. Certainly, allowing decades to elapse between bilateral prime ministerial visits to capitals such as Bangkok, Manila, Hanoi and Phnom Penh is not good enough. All recent PMs have visited Indonesia in their first bilateral trip abroad. But after Jakarta, with his excellent and well-credentialed entourage, Mr Albanese went off the well-trodden diplomatic path, visiting Makassar and reminding his audience of the ancient connections between Sulawesi seafarers and the Yulnu people of Arnhem Land. I thought this was interesting and effective. And so was Senator Wong's self-introduction in Bahasa, Indonesia, which reminded us and the region that the Foreign Minister has her own Southeast Asian origin story, which will help to revitalise our ties. Stepping up our outreach to the region, though, will not be enough if Australia is unwilling to listen to regional perspectives and accord them real weight. The proposed Special Envoy for Southeast Asia, for example, should do more listening than talking and help ensure that Canberra's attention doesn't drift once more. Let me finish on the great arc of Pacific Island nations to our north and east, reaching from Papua New Guinea to Kiribati. Of course, the geography of these countries gives them strategic significance to us. But if we treat our relationships with these countries as transactional, then we shouldn't be surprised if we sometimes end up on the wrong side of the transaction. For too long, Australia has kept the Pacific at arm's length. Embracing our Pacific family, showing them respect and listening to them is the smart thing to do and the right thing to do. This will require resources, but in the Pacific, relationships are just as important. The Foreign Minister has struck exactly the right note in her early visits to Fiji, Samoa, Tonga and Solomon Islands. In the Defence Minister, we have a lifelong Pacific enthusiast. We need to increase the pace of ministerial visits to the Pacific, and we need to make it easier for Pacific nations, for people from Pacific nations to visit Australia and to work and live amongst us. One great thing we could do to deepen our relations with Asia and the Pacific would be to fund Australian universities properly to provide more scholarships and training programs for future leaders from the region. Our universities used to be a cradle for the region's brightest minds, but that has fallen away. And during the Fortress Australia period, we pushed international students away from us rather than pulling them towards us. We should use our universities and other educational institutions to create an Indo-Pacific web of friendship and influence. Ladies and gentlemen, let me close by mentioning two issues of history and identity. Strictly speaking, these are not foreign policy issues, but then I've always believed that foreign policy begins at home. First, the voice. It's past time, in my opinion, to recognise First Nations peoples in our Constitution as a milestone on the way towards recognising them in our hearts. An Indigenous voice to Parliament will provide a mechanism for Indigenous Australians to be consulted on laws that will affect them directly. Many constitutional conservatives have testified that it would do no violence to our democratic processes. I hope that we are large enough as a country to do this thing. And second, the Republic. I believe that Australia's head of state should be an Australian citizen who lives in Australia, who is chosen by Australians and represents Australians. I have the greatest respect for Her Majesty the Queen, who has reigned for 70 years with dignity, grace and good humour. But the Queen's reign is entering its final years, and before long, sadly, we will need to consider our constitutional arrangements without reference to that remarkable woman. Becoming a republic would make us prouder and more purposeful. It would be an expression of faith that there are Australians capable of filling every office under the Constitution, including the highest one. It would be a demonstration of confidence in our shared future here in this part of the world. An Australian president would travel overseas as our representative in the same way the Queen has so ably represented Britain abroad. But I don't say that we should become a republic so that others respect us more. We should become a republic so that we respect ourselves more. Australia is a great country. An Indigenous voice to Parliament and a republic would make us greater. Ladies and gentlemen, in my first press club address in 2014, I said that as wealth and power moved eastwards towards us, Australia's tyranny of distance has been replaced by the predicament of proximity. Looking back nearly a decade later, I don't think I exaggerated. Events are pressing in on us now. The Albanese government should respond by returning to a three-dimensional approach to the world, one that has height, width and depth. This means working with our global ally, using international institutions to solve global problems, and enlivening our connections with Asia and the Pacific, and doing all these things at once. We also need to restore a sense of balance to our international policies, balance between diplomacy and defence, between what we say and what we do, and between old alliances and new relationships. We need to be strong on China and strong on climate. The challenges we face require no less. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. That was a wide-ranging address, very thought-provoking, and at times, I'm sure, for some, relatively controversial. So I'll be interested to hear what the other questioners have to say. I'd just be interested to get your thoughts on Anthony Albanese's immediate decision he needs to make about whether to take up the invitation to go to Ukraine. He's heading to the Nato summit in Madrid. It's possible he could continue on. What do you think would be the significance of Australia's Prime Minister making that decision, and do you think there are drawbacks if he decides not to?
First of all, thank you for hosting me in your first outing at the Press Club. First of all, Australia has a huge stake in the Ukraine war. I said that the invasion of Ukraine has been the greatest disruption of the international order since the Second World War. And that has implications for us because we have enjoyed the benefits of that order. A Russian victory would make more invasions like this, would make invasions like this more common. It would be a big win for countries that challenge the international order. So I think we have a big stake in it, and so I would encourage Prime Minister Albanese to visit. We've made a big contribution so far in terms of bushmasters, artillery and ammunition. I read a lovely story in the paper today where a Ukrainian soldier was saying how much he liked the bushmaster, is enjoying the air conditioning. He says, I almost want to live there. The Ukrainian ambassador today told me that there are Ukrainian babies that have been named after the Javelin weapon system, so pretty soon we're going to have some young Ukrainians called Bushmaster. So look, we've provided ammunition, material, Bushmasters, and I think the Prime Minister visiting would add to that. I think it would continue the personal diplomacy that he's kicked off so effectively. So I'd encourage him to do so.
All right. Sarah Eisen.
Sarah Eisen from The Australian. Look, back in the 90s, you used to work for Paul Keating. He's now very critical of Australia's management of the China relationship. Have you spoken with him about this, and do you agree with any of his commentary? And if I may, why do you think some of the more old guard of Labor, Keating, Carr, seem more maybe more pro-China, more concerned about Australia's narrative on China than possibly some of the new guard of Labor?
Well, different people have different opinions, don't they? I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't speak for them. I wouldn't say they're pro-China. I mean, in my case, I worked for Mr. Keating when I was a very young man. I was in my early 20s working in the PMO. My eyes were like saucers. I felt it was an enormous privilege to work for a strong Prime Minister who was changing Australia. I don't always agree with Paul Keating, but I always listen to him, and I think he's always worth listening to. He has a different view. Mr. Carr has a different view, but all I can tell you is that I come to my view from observing Chinese interlocutors. I come to my view from sitting in the Shangri-La dialogue 10 days ago and watching General Wei's uncompromising speech. So that's where I come down on China.
And have you spoken with Keating about some of these big issues regarding China?
We talk about, well, I'm lucky enough he's played an important role in my life, and I speak to him about a lot of different things, and I always listen to him carefully.
Nothing to disclose here.
David.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you, Michael, for your speech. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne. Getting back to Anna's question about Anthony Albanese's visit to Madrid for the NATO summit, it's a very unusual summit, a rare moment actually, when we're not just getting an Australian Prime Minister going to a NATO summit, which has happened before with Julia Gillard and with Kevin Rudd, but we've also got the Japanese Prime Minister attending, the South Korean President, and Jacinda Ardern has also said that she will be attending the NATO summit in Madrid. This Asia focus for NATO seems quite, well, it's not common. How do you see NATO changing, and what is your view of the connection between NATO and the Asia Pacific? Obviously, there's a lot to discuss with Ukraine, and Australia is assisting in Ukraine. Is there more that Australia can do to help NATO? Is there more that NATO can do to help Australia when we've got tensions in our region?
Look, I think in the end, NATO is always going to be focused on the North Atlantic. And I've hosted a NATO Secretary General. I think increasingly European countries are aware of the challenges that China faces, but I think ultimately it's for the people in this region to provide security for this region. I think rather than this summit showing that Asia can change the game in NATO or NATO can change the game in Asia, I would say it demonstrates what I referred to, this remarkable quickening of connections between like-minded countries and democracies. I have been amazed and thrilled at this quickening. All around the world, in our part of the world, in South Korea, in Singapore, in Japan, but in like-minded parts of the world has responded to the invasion of Ukraine. We've realised what's at stake. Suddenly, debates about the liberal international order that seemed theoretical were extremely practical. I feel it even at my level with think tank directors talking to each other and working out, are there things that we can do at the margin? I've also felt that quickening of connections in recent years as Australia has come under this campaign of economic intimidation. I've seen European and North American think tank directors and diplomats again reach out to the Lowy Institute and say, how can we work together? How can we thicken connections between each other? So that's how I would interpret it. To me, it's one of the positive byproducts of an awful act. But in the end, I think security in our region is going to have to be provided by players in our region. I don't think we can look to NATO for that.
Stephen Judgetts.
Hi, thanks for your speech, Michael. Can I just ask on one question that you haven't touched on directly, I think, so far, which is the prospect of democratic decay in the United States and obviously the political polarisation that we see at the moment. Some commentators believe that the US will be fine. Others seem to believe that it's on the precipice of losing its democracy. You're a keen observer of US politics. What's your assessment about the prospect of democratic resilience in the United States? How serious do you see the threat to that democratic resilience to be? And what implications does this have for Australia's national security?
Look, it's a shocking thing for a friend of America, for an Americophile, for someone like me that's lived in Washington to watch the testimony from the January 6 committee and to watch the events from January 6. We know now that the sitting President of the United States attempted a constitutional coup, attempted a coup against the constitutional order of the Great Republic. And I think all of us felt the quivers during the Trump era, that the country that is in the cockpit of the international order, that democracy was under threat. And I think all of us held on, waiting and hoping that the fever will pass. And for the most part, the fever did pass. I wouldn't exaggerate it, and there are serious challenges that last there, but in the end, the United States took a look at Donald Trump, and they decided not to re-elect him. They put him in the loser. They put him in the loser pile. So personally, I bet on America. I believe in the resilience of American institutions. The American civil service, the military, the courts stayed strong during that period. So while I think it's serious, in the end, I'm an optimist about the United States. What does it mean for Australia? Well, for 71 years, America has been, as Mr. Albanese said, a central pillar of our foreign policy. It's the most powerful country in the world, the only country that can project influence anywhere on earth. It's been a reliable ally of the United States. It's provided a security guarantee which deters acts of intimidation. It provides much of the intelligence in the Five Eyes network. It provides the interactions with the ADF that keep our military sharp. So, to my mind, betting on the alliance still makes sense. That doesn't mean that the United States doesn't have challenges ahead, but to me it makes sense, and 9 out of 10 Australians seem to agree. By the way, thank you for coming, Steve. It wouldn't be a foreign policy event these days without Stephen Gigic, and I hope you've been live tweeting as well.
Very true, yes. Hashtag NPC. Daniel Hurst.
Hashtag Lowy Institute.
Hashtag thanks for joining us. Daniel Hurst from Guardian Australia. Sort of further to the previous point, but more about AUKUS directly, and it goes to the relationship with America. Shortly after the AUKUS deal was announced, Senator Wong made some public comment seeking assurances about Australia as we get more technologically dependent on the US, assurances about the fact that we, in order for us to be able to maintain our strategic autonomy to defend ourselves as we choose for ourselves. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you see the AUKUS arrangement when it comes to the nuclear-powered submarines? How do you see that in terms of Australia maintaining our autonomy to make our own decisions in war?
Well, all these capability decisions should be about increasing Australian independence and sovereignty. That's the whole reason you have a defence force. So that's absolutely critical. I would say that, to me, the larger threat to Australian sovereignty and independence doesn't come from a like-minded democracy. It comes from a huge superpower in our own region that is run by a Leninist political party. And to me, the AUKUS arrangement will strengthen our independence and sovereignty because it will give us access to technologies that increase the deterrent power that we have. So I guess I used to hear, you would hear the deputy sheriff argument a lot more back in the day when the threats to the liberal international order were more theoretical. Now that they're more practical, it's interesting that you are seeing, as I mentioned, countries around the world realising that the best way to secure your independence and sovereignty is to work with allies and friends. And to me, I put AUKUS into that category. sometime, Churchill gave a speech in 1941 saying that for the United States and the United Kingdom to prosper, their affairs are going to have to get somewhat mixed up in each other. He was talking about the Lend-Lease aid program. And to me, I put AUKUS in that category. I put Five Eyes in that category. I put the thickening connections between Australia and other democracies in that category. We have to get a little bit more mixed up with each other in order to protect our sovereignty and our independence.
Just picking up on that, do you think there are some risks, though, despite the benefits?
Some risks from...
For the autonomy of Australia and its sovereignty, to having that thickening of relationships and sharing that kind of technology?
Look, the bottom line is that when you're talking about nuclear propulsion, when you're talking about advanced cyber, AI, quantum technologies, these technologies are never going to be mastered and run by a country like Australia. I don't think we really have any choice if we want to take advantage of those technologies than by cooperating much more closely with other like-minded countries.
Thank you. Andrew Tillett.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review. Thank you, Michael, for your speech. I was going to ask an AUKUS-related question, but the other thing I had in mind, though, was it's probably a bit unusual. It's probably a structural thing with the government, the new government, that we have a Deputy Prime Minister who's also Defence Minister, which I think we'd have to go back to Lance Barnard in the 70s for that to happen. It's a very Israeli thing to have Deputy PM and Defence Minister, by the by. But anyway, we have a Foreign Minister who has known and is a close personal friend of the Prime Minister for 30 years. And we saw that sort of closeness on show during the election campaign, on election night, and at the Labor launch when Penny Wong introduced Anthony Albanese. There's a closeness and a warmness there between them. How will that sort of play out on a both, I guess, in terms of domestic politics, and when you have two very senior people in that strategic foreign policy role at the very top of government, but also too when those people go around to meet other people overseas? The Deputy Prime Minister, for instance, is going to CHOGM. I doubt we would have sent Barnaby Joyce to meet CHOGM. The Deputy Prime Minister is the Defence Minister. Barnaby Joyce was Infrastructure Minister, sort of thing. It's not quite the same gravitas that it has. I just wanted that sort of, how that will sort of play out, that's at the very heart of the government, this senior closeness there.
Thank you. Look, I guess it presents some operational complexities in the sense that it's probably harder, harder for the Defence Minister, or impossible for the Defence Minister to be travelling when the Prime Minister's travelling, for example, because he'd be acting Prime Minister, I presume. So I suppose there are some complexities, but in general, I would say it's all upside. I mean, we know, DFAT officers here know the difference between the centrality that they play in these debates in Canberra when they have a Foreign Minister who is close to the Prime Minister of the day. So I think that's a big positive for Australia's foreign policy. I think it's a great signal to the world that our Defence Minister is also the Deputy Prime Minister and also, as I mentioned, a Pacific enthusiast. But so I think those things are all positive. I think the priority that this government has put on international relations in the first 4 weeks has been a little unexpected and very cheering for the head of a foreign policy think tank. I mean, such a big impact in a short period of time. But let me just say, the domestic ministers don't get off lightly either. And we saw Ed Husic accompany the Prime Minister on that very successful trip to Indonesia. All these, just as like-minded countries are getting more mixed up in each other's affairs, I think the domestic and foreign policy issues are also getting more mixed up. And so I think it's very heartening to see other senior domestic ministers who are out there speaking on our behalf.
Thank you.
Kim Bergman.
It's Kim Bergman from Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. I'd like to take you back to the issue of nuclear-powered submarines and nuclear weapons proliferation. If Australia continues down its current path, each submarine that we receive will have enough enriched uranium in it to make about 100 nuclear warheads. Now, a lot of this stuff is top secret, but the IAEA estimates that you could take that stuff that powers submarines and convert it back into bomb material in about 2 weeks. What if other countries, not so well-intentioned, start to go down the same path of acquiring submarines powered by nuclear weapons material? Does it make Australia safer, or does it have the opposite effect?
I think the first or the second question I got today was quoting Paul Keating at me, and one of my favourite Keating quotes was when he said in 1989, you walk into any pet shop in Australia and the resident galah will be talking about microeconomic policy. You remember that? I do feel at the moment that everybody in Australia is talking about nuclear subs, and this is no reflection on the questioner, just that everybody has a view on nuclear subs. I'm not an expert on nuclear subs, but I would say that what the briefings that I've had have left me confident that there are not non-proliferation risks from this particular kind of technology where it's all sealed in one unit. I noticed that Gareth Evans, who is no shirker on non-proliferation issues, came out about a year ago with a very strongly worded intervention that said that whether or not AUKUS makes sense from a political point of view, from a non-proliferation point of view, he was comfortable with it. And finally, I would just say that Australia has been seized of non-proliferation issues over many decades. Mr Albanese himself, I know it's been a personal crusade of his. So I'm pretty confident that non-proliferation issues won't be a problem.
Simon Gross.
Simon Gross, Canberra IQ. On your third dimension, the regional dimension and climate, the Lowy ran a piece, I think about 3 weeks ago, promoting the idea of a regional carbon bank. The idea being about 270 billion put in by about 20 countries, Australia and New Zealand committing to not draw down finance. How viable do you think that is? How would it fit into our aid and climate policies internationally? And what I figured that the regional, our regional friends would be happy about that. But what chance do you see of that getting up?
Well, one of the things in the Lowy Institute's DNA is that we have no house position on issues, and individual authors speak in their own name, and that particular article that you're referring to, which I think was edited by Dan Flitton, the brilliant editor of The Interpreter, is that person's view. So I'm not here to put that case to you. All I would say...
How do you assess that idea then?
Well, I think it's worthy of consideration for sure. I mean, Australia's back in the climate policy game. It feels like for a long time, even when we were doing important things, we weren't fully invested in it. Now we're back in the game, whether it's that kind of bank or rejoining other institutions that we've been less involved in. The fact of the matter is we know what the implications of climate change will be for our country in terms of bushfire and drought. We know what the implications of climate change will be for our region and for our Pacific family. We know what impact it's had on our reputation to be a climate laggard for too long. And so I think all those factors are pointing us in the direction of doing more and taking more creative steps. So I'd like to see the government look at that, certainly.
Krishani Danji.
Krishani Danji from SBS World News. Thank you for your speech. On the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, the Australian government's provided some financial support. The IMF is also looking to provide some relief, but it's unlikely that all of that will help the country turn around its economic situation. I wonder, is there a way forward, or what is the way forward for Sri Lanka, and what can be done?
Well, I mean, look, I'm not an expert on Sri Lanka. Obviously it is suffering from its huge debt burden. It's feeling the second order effects of some of the economic forces that I mentioned earlier. I think all that a country like Australia can do, I was pleased to see Claire O'Neill get over there, I think it was last week. I think the kinds of things that Australia and the international community can do is provide more development assistance, provide more food assistance in the short term, because we're seeing, unfortunately, real food shortages. But ultimately, these are sort of the second order effects of the economic forces I mentioned earlier.
Is there more that Australia should be doing, though, or are there potential either foreign policy or border consequences for us?
Well, I'm sure there are border consequences because people don't flee their homeland for fun. They flee it because they're hungry and they're poor and they are running out of options. And so the more that Australia, the more the international community can do to stabilise the economy of Sri Lanka, to prevent other countries from following Sri Lanka down that route, the better. And I think that's the best thing we can do. And then in the meantime, of course, maintaining the border protection settings that we have in place.
Ben Westacott.
Hi, Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. I just wanted to ask, obviously 2022 is a year of major elections and leadership contests for Australia, perhaps none more so than the National Party Congress in China later this year, where Xi Jinping will be likely standing for a third term as the leader of the country. What are the potential consequences of Australia of a sort of re-emboldened President Xi Jinping standing for a precedent-breaking third term, or for perhaps a new incumbent who's untested and who might be ruling with the sort of blessing of Xi Jinping?
Are there reports of a new incumbent that I've missed?
You never know in Chinese politics.
I think, unfortunately, you do know in Chinese politics, and I don't think the forces of democracy are going to flourish in that People's Congress. I think Mr. Xi is going to get his historic third term, and who knows, perhaps after that, an historic fourth term. What would it mean in terms of emboldening China? That's hard to say, because the real China experts, usually say like Natasha Kassam, who's with us today, usually say in the 12 months leading up to a meeting like this that everything goes quiet in Chinese foreign policy, and yet that's not true. That's not true this year at all. I have actually been the director of the Institute for about the same length of time that Xi Jinping has been president of the People's Republic of China. Let me say the two regimes are very different, as I hope my colleagues will testify. But I have personally watched as different successive generations of China analysts have been surprised and dismayed by the hardening of Chinese external and internal policy over that period. And it seems to me, as a non-expert, looking at it from the outside, reviewing the papers before they're published, that process is inexorable. So I don't know if we'll see a further emboldening after the meeting. But what I would say is, if you look at recent years, you look at the border clash with India a couple of years ago, if you look at the lasering of the RAAF aircraft recently, then the interception the other day, there's a pretty strong trend line. And so I imagine that trend line will continue.
Nick Stewart.
I just spoke to a couple of your subordinates, and they said you were a marvellous leader. So I can't imagine that there's any difference between more seriously, underlying everything that you spoke about was the fourth dimension, time. Now, this is something that when you look around this room, you see basically not necessarily Anglo, but certainly European dominance in terms of the facial issues, characteristics that we all have. Natasha is one of the few who is quite obviously non-European ancestry. I'm wondering, to what extent do you think Australia's debate, international debate, is dominated by the Western, not necessarily Anglo, but a Western perspective? And to what extent do you think that there are encouraging ways for other modern Australians who are largely, from other ethnicities to come up and to participate in that debate?
Look, thank you for that question. I guess the first thing I'd say is that as the son of an immigrant myself, I think immigration is such a nation-building force for Australia, and the successive waves of immigration from Anglo countries, from non-Anglo countries, from Asian countries have enriched our society. I think they've added to the perspectives that we have. I don't hold to ethnic determinism, if that's what you're sort of alluding to. I think those old debates about, for example, democracy not being an Asian thing, I think we've moved on from there. I think if you look, for example, at the way that Japan and South Korea have responded to the invasion of Ukraine with strong support, if you've looked at the way that Singapore has reacted. Singapore's reacted not out of sort of because of its cultural origins, but because of power politics. And Singapore realises that if big countries can invade small countries, then small countries like Singapore are at risk in future. So I think the Western tradition that we've inherited is one of the great elements of Australian life. The traditions that other generations of immigrants have brought have enriched us. But does it change our commitment to democracy, our links to other like-minded countries? I don't see any evidence of that, and I would say that the Lowy Institute polling figures that I've quoted to you today provide no evidence of that either.
Katie McLeod.
Hi, Dr. Fullilove, thanks very much for your speech. I'm Katie McLeod from NCA Newswire. Anthony Albanese has said this week he will not publicly intervene in the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States. You've been critical of Mr. Assange and the work of WikiLeaks in the past. Do you think Australia should intervene in his extradition? And following on from that, how do you think Australia can best manage the potential ramifications of the Assange case on its relationship with Washington?
I thought someone might ask me about Mr. Assange. Look, I think every Australian deserves, who gets into trouble abroad deserves the support of the Australian government. I happen to think Mr. Assange's case is a little more complicated than many in the media allow. There's probably no reason for me to go into that. I don't wish Mr. Assange ill will. I don't wish Mr. Assange ill, but I do wish that I more often got questions about other Australians in difficulty, like my friend Sean Turnell, for example, who's in prison in Naypyidaw for the crime of trying to improve the lives of Myanmar people, or Cheng Lei and others who are in prison in China on vague national security grounds. I just note that it's important for us all as Australians to be seized with the welfare of those people as well. In terms of Mr. Assange, which is your question, I think the second question was what's the best way of going about providing that support, I think is what you said. Look, often there are calls in the media for, to grab the loudhailer. The problem is sometimes a loudhailer can deafen the person on the other end of the loudhailer. Sometimes it produces static that is not productive. I have observed DFAT over a long period of time providing assistance to Australians in difficulty abroad. They seem to be very good at it, better than almost any other country I've encountered. Reading the tea leaves, I would say the new government has given DFAT writing instructions, and so I would have confidence that the approach that DFAT is taking, which at the moment is a quiet diplomacy one, is well judged. And of course, Mr. Assange, every Australian is important to the Australian government. He's not the only priority of the Australian government. So the Australian government has to manage a bunch of different priorities at once.
And I think one of the elements of Katie's question was about ramifications for the Canberra-Washington relationship. Is there something that has to be taken into account there in advocating? Well,
I think I was trying to hint at that by saying that loudhailers can deafen people. I mean, the United States is a proud democracy. They have prosecutors they have the rule of law. They have prosecutors who look at the evidence and don't take nicely to political instruction from the White House. So I think Australia has to be careful about that element, just as we would be a bit tetchy about someone trying to Bigfoot us about our legal processes. So we have to be careful. That doesn't mean that there's not lots of room for the Australian government to make representations on his behalf, and I'm sure they're doing it.
So if the Australian government and...
I think that's it.
Oh, sorry.
Kate, we'll move on. Thank you so much. Misha Schubert.
Misha Schubert, as a Vice President of the National Press Club. Michael, thank you for your address. It's lovely to have you back. I always feel like I could listen to a much longer masterclass from you talking about world affairs. Interested in your remarks about the opportunity for a widening of Indo-Pacific friendship relationships through education as a tool. We had the Colombo Plan in the 50s, which was a source of bringing some of the best talent from the region into Australia for education. Julie Bishop, of course, championed her signature initiative of the new Colombo Plan, Australian undergraduates going out into the region. Is your conception essentially we would need a new old Colombo Plan, if you like, to return to that original insight, which was about bringing many more of the prodigious emerging talents from the region here to study in our country and hopefully to develop an affection for it?
Thank you. Thanks, Misha. Delighted to see a fellow Republican too. Look, under the new Colombo Plan, I thought that was great. There was a lot of energy on the incoming direction, I guess. Sorry, I beg your pardon, on the outgoing direction. I'd like to see a bit more energy on the incoming generation as well. I'm just struck that as a young man, you would often read about leaders of Pacific and Southeast Asian countries who'd been educated at the ANU, at other universities. And as the international education market diversifies, that's changed a little bit. So I would like to see more energy going in both directions. I'd also like to see more opportunity for to liberalise our labour markets, to expand the number of people from Pacific Island countries, as I mentioned, who can live and work amongst us. Yes, maybe get a degree or get a qualification, but also live in Australia, send remittances back home, thicken the connections that way. I think more energy in both directions. So I love the pithy way you've described it as the new old Colombo Plan. That's perfect.
And Tony Melville.
Tony Melville, Director of the National Press Club. Thanks for the speech, Michael. You mentioned early on in your remarks Penny Wong's address in Bahasa, Indonesia, when she visited Jakarta. But if you look at the number of Australians, and it's a follow-up in some way to the previous question, there's something like 300, by last counts, high school students, final year high school students studying Bahasa in Australia, which is extraordinarily low. Previous governments have done a lot on language and have done a lot on programs to help businesses as well understand business culture and understand how to deal with Asia. What can this government do, do you think, to try and bump those numbers up?
I think they can lead from the top. I mean, it is impressive to see Penny Wong speak in Bahasa, just as it was impressive, Ambassador, to hear that she had a first conversation with the French Foreign Minister, I think, also in French. Australians are not used to having leaders who are linguists. I know Chris Bowen is also a student of Bahasa. Look, I mean, there's lots of policy things that can be done, but personally, I would focus on the leadership from the summit. I think having ministers, having our leading citizens showing Australians the way, showing that these countries are rich interlocutors. Mr Albanese pointing to the ancient connections between our Indigenous people and the countries in our region. To me, that's the most powerful signal of support for Asian languages.
All right, well, I think that's where we'll leave it. Ladies and gentlemen, let's conclude on that note and say a very warm thank you to Dr. Michael Fullilove.
Thank you.